I'm joined by the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy. Lisa Nandy, I want to talk about the Omicron variant first. The Prime Minister's reintroduced quarantine measures. We've now got contact tracing again, stricter rules on face masks. I'm guessing you support those measures. Are they enough?
Yeah, I want to thank the scientists who spotted the danger with this new Omicron variant very quickly. And the government, of course, has announced a new package of measures which we'll consider in Parliament on Monday. But when the Prime Minister comes to Parliament on Monday, there are a number of outstanding holes in our defences that he's got to address. There still seems to have been very little action on ventilation in public buildings, especially schools, which is going to cause major problems if we think the virus, the new variant, is as transmissible as scientists are suggesting. There are still some outstanding issues around travel. The government is saying everyone has to have a PCR test on day 2 when they arrive back in the UK, but they're not suggesting pre-departure tests for people before they board flights. There's no advice for people about travelling back from the airport on public transport, and there are very few checks on the PCR tests that are done. So these are all things that for months the government has been warned about. And when he comes to Parliament on Monday, these are things that he's going to have to be able to answer.
So these are, generally speaking, though, issues of detail, aren't they? But you aren't pressing for a return to working from home or mandatory masks in hospitality venues and so on.
We've always said that mask wearing in crowded spaces and flexible working from home where people can ought to be part of Plan A. We've been watching COVID rates rise across the country for several months now, and we've been urging the government to do this much more quickly. We've always said as well that the government ought to be guided by the science, and it would be one of the questions we'll be asking on Monday of the Prime Minister is what are the scientists advising about mask wearing? Is this a political decision to try to limit mask wearing only to public transport and shops, or are there good reasons why we ought to consider extending that? In the end, this is about preventing the virus from getting out of control, more people dying, the NHS being overwhelmed, and another lockdown taking place. And we've been keen to avoid that since day one. And that's why we want the government to come to Parliament on Monday and be able to answer those, what I think are fairly reasonable questions.
It sounds to me as though, to some extent, you accept what lies behind what the Health Secretary has just been saying to me, which is that there's a kind of balance to be struck between responding to new variants and making sure we don't shut down life as it's currently being carried on, businesses and so on and so forth. In essence, you are accepting the strategy that Mr. Johnson laid out yesterday.
So there is a balance to be struck. I think the Health Secretary is right about that. We don't think the government has been getting the balance right up to now, and that's why we support the measures to bring in greater use of masks, mandatory masks in some settings, and we'll be asking questions about whether the scientific basis for that suggests that that needs to go further. We desperately want to see them tighten up the travel restrictions. There's a real problem when for 18 months the government has been warned that there are holes in those defences and still hasn't taken action to plug what you rightly suggested are just practical measures that could be dealt with in order to stop the new variant spreading around the country. If we have one big criticism of the government's approach, it's actually about why these new variants are emerging. We haven't met our promises that we made this summer at the G7 to get the vaccine rolled out to other parts of the globe. There is now sufficient vaccine in order to ensure that it reaches almost every adult in the world. The problem is that there is no global plan to get the vaccine to people in places like South Africa and many of the surrounding countries that have even worse rates of vaccination. And as the Chief Medical Officer has said to us many, many times, when you have huge numbers and rising numbers of cases of COVID, that's when you're more likely to see new variants emerging. The government has been warned about this. The Prime Minister said that we were leading the world on this on Saturday. It is simply not true. We're lagging behind the European Union. We're nowhere near coming close to meeting the commitments that he made this summer. And until and unless we start to show some global leadership around this, we're going to keep seeing this reappearing.
But this is a global issue, isn't it? I mean, the South Africans have been saying in the last 48 hours that the number of vaccinations that are sitting in the vaults, I mean, there are numbers between 100 million and 500 million being quoted unused, is a scandal for the whole of Europe and North America. It's not just a British problem, is it?
Well, it's a British problem because you can see that we're now dealing with the Omicron variant on our shores, and it's having major implications for the way that people live, as well as for the National Health Service. So, of course, you're right that it's a problem that requires global cooperation, but it requires Britain to do our part. And currently, the UK is not delivering on the promises that we made. We said we'd get 100 million vaccines out to the rest of the world, and then instead of doing that, we've delivered about 10% of that commitment. And we've also slashed aid to many of the countries that need investment in their healthcare systems in order to get the jabs into people's arms. The Prime Minister knows this. He knows that this is the reason, this lack of global leadership is the reason why we're seeing new variants emerge. And so while we're keen to support measures to protect the British public and protect the NHS, you really have to ask why the government hasn't got its act together in order to tackle the problem at source, when in June the Prime Minister was keen to wave a British flag and say that that's precisely what he was doing.
There's been anger in Southern Africa at the stopping of flights. Would you have supported that had you been asked?
I think it's absolutely the right thing to do to suspend flights from not just South Africa but surrounding countries, and I appreciate that that is a very difficult thing when it happens to countries. I mean, certainly, I had many constituents making representations to me when we had travel bans in place for Britain. For quite a long time, Britons couldn't fly to the United States, for example, because of the high rates here. And it is a very difficult thing to accept. But the first duty of any government is to keep its citizens safe. I think these measures are sensible. And one of the questions that we've asked the Health Secretary to address is whether there are other countries that ought to be added to that list, countries in the area, in the region, with high rates of infection, and whether the government is going to come forward with ways to check on the PCR tests that are being done when people return to the UK. We can't afford to keep making the same mistakes that we've made for 18 months over and over again and leave these big holes in our defences at a time when we're struggling to get on top of an existing or new variant.
Let's turn to what also appears to be a perennial problem to which we haven't found a solution, that is the Channel crossings with the deaths this week. Everyone, including you, says that French and British need to sit down, work together. That's a given. But why hasn't that happened? Do you think, who's to blame here? Is it Boris Johnson for being overly provocative, or is it Emmanuel Macron for overreacting?
Well, France blames Britain, Britain blames France. The truth is that both governments are engaging in a blame game while children drown off our coastline. It's just simply unconscionable, and any responsible government on either side of the Channel would set aside those differences and work together to deal with what is a collective shared problem that will only be solved together. It's not just that they've failed to agree the very pressing and urgent need to disrupt the people smugglers, as Sajid Javid was just saying to you, by working together to have coastal patrols and other measures. It's also that we haven't been able to work together to tackle the things that are driving the movement of people. The asylum system across Europe and across the world has completely broken down. If you look at the countries that people are fleeing from, it's Syria, it's Afghanistan. There are reasons why people are on the move, and the world has been completely unable to come together to deal with that. The government is writing open letters to the French that they're releasing via social media, calling on the French to do things that any responsible government would have already done to get in place a mechanism across Europe to be able to return people to safe third countries they travel through, to agree safe and legal routes for people who we owe obligations to come here. And Sajid Javid just told you, Trevor, that the government is legislating to make that happen. You can't legislate just to criminalise organisations like the RNLI who go out to try and help people in the Channel and think that will solve the problem. One of the people on the boat that sank just a week ago was an Afghan soldier who said he'd given up hope of being able to get to Britain through a legal route, because although the Home Secretary announced an expansion of the Afghan refugee settlement scheme, that scheme hasn't even opened yet, and that was 3 months ago. These routes simply don't exist, and they won't exist for as long as the government continues to engage in a blame game with others and doesn't do the hard yards of sitting down round the table and agreeing how we're going to tackle this together.
Let's talk about what, if you were sitting down with the French, what you would actually be saying to them. Could I first understand, what is Labour's priority here? And I'm talking not about in general, I'm talking about what you would do this week. Is it to make sure that nobody drowns, which would mean, for example, taking people on board British Coast Guard or Navy ships, irrespective of whether they had a genuine claim or not? Or is it making sure that we get the numbers who are landing down, which would imply that what you want to do, above all, is turn those boats back? What is Labour's actual priority? What would be the instructions that your government would give to the border force?
Well, of course we want to stop people drowning off our coastline. It's simply unconscionable that we've got this happening and involving children as well, and people who we owe obligations to. But the way that you do that is twofold. Firstly, you don't criminalise those like the RNLI who are trying to assist them, or put wave machines in the Channel, as Priti Patel has suggested, to simply smash those boats out of the water. You do that by trying to disrupt a system that is thriving on people's despair and on criminality. So we should be working with the French to arrest those people smugglers who are fueling this and are providing unsafe passage for people. They're profiting from human misery. So we need joint French-British action to do that. We should be intercepting these boats, we should be arresting the people smugglers, and we should be stopping people from drowning. But then we ought to be working together in order to deal with the bigger issue. And let me just give you an example. I met with the Pakistani government at the height of the Afghan refugee crisis. There are 1.4 million Afghan refugees in camps in Pakistan alone. Some of those are people to whom Britain owes obligations, but there is no route to get here at all at the moment. Others are people that France could potentially assist, Canada, Australia, the United States and other countries besides. But until we have a global asylum system that is capable of responding to that and sharing the strain of this together, we are going to see desperate people making desperate crossings, and we've got to deal with it.
I get that, but with respect, this is a real issue for every single day from now. Somebody who is running one of these smuggling rings, watching this interview now, will have taken from what you said just now that if he is prepared to play chicken with these people's lives, a Labour administration would simply say, OK, we'll let this one in. Aren't you actually simply encouraging the people smugglers to believe that in the end, if they are prepared to put people in these small boats, they will get across?
Well, firstly, let me speak directly to your hypothetical people smuggler. Under a Labour government, if you were to continue with this reckless disregard for human life, we will work with international partners to find you, to intercept you and to lock you up for a very long time. This is profiting from human misery and it simply won't stand. We would open up safe and legal routes with our international partners and urge other countries to do the same, to pull the rug out from under the business model that these smugglers currently rely on, of desperate people who have no other options. And we would work with our international partners to tackle the underlying drivers of conflict and insecurity, including climate change, which is forcing many people, 26 million people, to move across the world. Unless and until we have a government that is capable of responding to the scale of the challenge, the only people that benefit are the people smugglers, and the rest of us all lose.
Lisa Nandy, thank you very much indeed for your time.